Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, Freeform edition. This is episode 15 of this particular edition. And for those of you that are joining the podcast fairly new, just to kind of give you what this is, the format of Freeform is there is no real format. Generally, it's just me talking about specific issues that I'm interested in or have relevance to those listening, and I talk a little bit about all sorts of random things, and it doesn't have a scripting usually, and it doesn't follow any particular agenda. It's different than our history podcast episodes, which obviously are very much focused in on a specific script to keep me focused and to keep the podcast on target, which is always important, and as well to keep it linked to the actual history we're talking about. And then we have our Ancient Wales podcast, which features, at the moment, discussions about Iron Age Britain. And we're going back through some of the history and archaeological evidence from there. And we're moving slowly but surely towards from the Iron Age to the Roman Britain period. And that will, in and of itself, have its own little separate playlist or feature, and it may even have its own feed to go along with it to kind of help people find it. And it will be a long form podcast talking about Roman Britain and about the origins of Roman Britain, about the societies of Roman Britain, and how much we understand now versus, say, even the nearly 10 years ago that I started this podcast. It's very hard to believe that it's been 9 years since this podcast began. And I just kind of want to talk a little bit about that today. I don't want to rehash too much of the old things, but I do want to kind of give you a background on myself and kind of how I got there. So we've discussed in the past that I went to university. I did history as my university degree. So I again, don't really want to get into that, but that I also sought to do a master's and eventually a PhD in it. That didn't work out for a number of different reasons. And because of that, I kind of felt a little hole in my heart, if you want to call it that, uh, for not being able to do what I wanted to do as my career. So that kind of was always at the back of my mind. I really enjoy history. I enjoy archaeology. I have been fascinated by both and in a number of different places. My degree was focused in on American history, but I've followed Canadian history quite closely over the years. I've also obviously followed British history quite closely and, fell into the idea of doing podcasting a number of years ago, probably, well, actually I want to say 13 years ago, I started listening to podcasts full time on my way to work and back, and sometimes during work, depending on how and what was going on at work. And it started out listening to various things from, history podcasts to news podcasts to sports podcasts to eventually D&D podcasts, and the format of the time of doing long form storytelling via D&D campaigns. And because of that, I ended up becoming very much involved with that community, and so much so that there was a group that started up talking, effectively doing a podcast on a podcast. They were initially doing a roundtable from the fans listening to one particular podcast where we would talk about the podcast, about the decisions that were made, about the strategies and tactics and storyline, and it became very obsessive and very nerdy. So, I mean, not to go too far in, but that's kind of where we began the podcasting side of it. And then we decided to start our own campaign. Initially, we kind of thought of doing it within the bounds of the podcast we were following, but over time it became obvious that we wanted to get away from that, and it became a different place, a different location with different things going on. And I think that was a wise move for a number of different reasons, but it worked out. And we did that podcast pretty consistently for about 5 years. It kind of faded for a bit and then came back for a couple more years after that. And then now is no longer being recorded, but it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it for the most part. It's very challenging sometimes to record these kind of podcasts because sometimes it can, it's a D&D campaign, and if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, you know that sometimes those campaigns can go on for a very long time of hours long recording sessions for us of like on more than one occasion of about 6 hours, which just was a lot of time and effort on a podcast. And that was tough. And yet at the same time, I did enjoy it quite a lot. And so much so that we started another podcast, which I kind of centered around the idea of discussing uh, cultural things, talking about movies and television and cultural aspects and events. And that kind of was the first time I led a podcast on my own. But it only lasted a short time, relatively, just a year, because at the time I was too busy doing a bunch of other things. We had our own YouTube channel going on at the time, and we were trying to do recordings for that, and then doing the podcast as well, and trying to always find people to interview and talk to was difficult. So it became kind of one of those things where it just got so busy and so crowded in on everything. I just kind of gave up. And I honestly, that was okay because I think it was kind of one of a million of those type of podcasts. So I don't know that it was special enough to really gather in. But I met some great friends through doing both of those podcasts, and carried forward in doing a YouTube channel, doing streaming. And because of that, we did. I mean, if you've ever listened to this podcast, I know in a few episodes, we talk about our fundraisers that we did, and those all were related to this group and trying to do that. And I always felt that was very worthwhile. Fundraising for sick children hospitals is one of those things it's very close to my heart, both figuratively and literally. And so for me, that was something where I kind of saw it as something I just had to do and I wanted to do. And we raised a lot of money. I mean, we raised over $10,000 over the years, and from a group that was fairly small. And I was always very proud of that. And it's one of the things I will always take with me from that group, along with the friends that I've made, as being super important. And we stopped the group, well, at least from my aspect, I stopped a couple of years ago because I had run out of momentum because I was doing this podcast not full time, but enough to be busy. And I just didn't have the time to do streaming as well and do videos and everything else that I'd been doing. It was just too cluttered. And at the same time, my workplace was changing and I was migrating away from kind of having the same access to and time to do the things I need to do to make that much work really happen. Editing this podcast takes a good, for every minute you're recording, you're almost doing anywhere from 2 to 3 minutes editing to try and get it to work right. And hey, if you've listened to some of these, the editing's a little sketchy at times. So that tells you how much work it is to get it right. And it's taken me years to get the sound to sound right. It's taken me years to get the visuals to sound better, look better when you're doing it for a video format. And especially when you're just doing it like I am, where it's just me presenting. Good news about that is, though, is that we will be having an interview, I believe, next week. And if not next week, in a couple weeks' time, which I'm very excited about. I hope you guys will be as excited as I am, talking about the development of football in Wales. And so I'm looking forward to it. It's been something I've been trying to do. Been telling you guys I wanted to do this for years. And it's been difficult because trying to arrange times with people when you don't live anywhere near them, 7 hour time difference and all the other fun stuff of work makes it difficult. So it was good to actually get that arranged. And I'm quite excited. So hopefully we're recording that next week. And hopefully it'll go out on the next podcast feed, but it might be a couple of weeks after that. We'll see. All depends on how much editing is involved. That's basically what it comes down to. But yeah, for me, that's a big part of it. And I want to dedicate more time to this podcast, which was another reason, because at the time I was looking at this podcast and seeing that it was a struggle for me to do 2 podcasts a month, and episodes a month, I should say. And then being tied up with all these other things was just making it even more difficult, especially when you're having to do the research, the writing, the script creation and stuff. And it makes it difficult to get ahead. Something that I'll probably have to do starting the beginning of next year is getting ahead on some of these episodes a bit more frequently, because of some changes that might be coming. So, but I won't get into that right now. But as we get closer to that period, I will let you know what's going on. But it shouldn't affect the podcast at all. Just affect the way the podcast looks for a little bit, or maybe the way it's my ability to flex in and out of things will be a lot less because I'll just have to do a bunch of recording separate and ahead of time just to make sure that when I'm away and transitioning through different things that it won't be problematic. A bit like when you go on holidays and you have to do a bunch of work beforehand. That's kind of what I'm thinking of it being as. But that's one thing. So the other thing is that as I examined the idea of doing the podcast, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before, so I apologize if this is a repeat, but I really evaluated strongly about what I wanted to do with the podcast and how do we make a history podcast that's interesting. And then it became more of and initially what my thought process was is I would write out, instead of writing out a firm script, I'd write out bullet points with quotes and with things to refer back to. And it became very quickly apparent to me after doing a few of those that I was having to edit them a lot more because there was a lot more mistakes. And two, that I wasn't as good on everything as I would like to be, and I think it made it much more difficult to be truthful to the research, I guess is how I would describe it. So for me, that's why it became much more firmly scripted, and you should know that all of the other podcasts, except for this one, are heavily scripted. I usually spend a lot of time and effort trying to write the scripts up. They run from anywhere from 5 to up to 7 pages, depending on the script, and that runs about 30 minutes worth of a script episode. Hopefully, sometimes they're shorter, sometimes they're longer. It really depends on the topic and how much I understand before I even went into it, because of course that helps me to riff on stuff a little easier. Because when you know already, okay, I know about this, I've studied this before, I've ran through this before. This is why the Iron Age podcast is a little bit easier to do right now, because we've done this before. And so I know how to avoid repeating a lot of the same discussion points from the original series. The original series is different than this one, so it's good in that respect. I'm putting a lot more effort in trying to find more sourcing, trying to find more evidence, trying to find more modern evidence of different things. So it's helping to kind of make it a little easier to be able to do that. And of course, I'm not as restricted as I was then with about the 4 or 5 books and a few websites that I could find in my searching. And so that's something that I'm definitely wanting to get right with this series, is have it be better research, better information, more traditionally a history podcast. And as I look at the video format, that's one thing I will talk a little bit about. Right now, currently, our video format is just me talking. If you're watching it on video, that's pretty obvious. But I'm thinking about trying to shake it up a bit and maybe have more other images to put in and things of that nature. I've done that somewhat, but this would be much more detailed and much more divided. It's just the problem is the editing of it would be a lot more, which is part of the reason why I've kind of avoided it, I'll be honest. And it's part of the reason why when I record the YouTube version, I don't change it from the podcast version. They're literally the exact same recording. I don't add special things just for the YouTube channel or just for the podcast feed. And because it's a talking head kind of thing, you don't need to see the visual because there's no visual to see. But it is something I've thought a little bit about, and it is definitely something that I think with the Roman Britain podcast, I will definitely change. Is I think I will make the visuals a little bit more interesting. It also depends because there is a possibility I could be in the UK next year, and if I am, then I will have time to possibly get more. Biggest thing that holds me back is the amount of actual access I have to things, and not being able to go to the museums, not being able to go to the sites. You don't have a lot of photos or video that you can kind of run through, and what video I do have is awful. And I wouldn't want to use it based on how it looks currently because there's just not it. I've got to send it through a lot of editing. One of the reasons why the St. Helios Church video that I've been wanting to do for years has never been done is because the original copy is not great, and I've been waiting for the technology to kind of catch up so that I can make the video look better, and hopefully we're there. I'm going to actually start doing editing of that next week because I have a week off from work, and I'm going to take some of that time to do that and see if I can get it looking good. And that'll go up to Patreon first and foremost, and it'll eventually roll out to the podcast / YouTube channel after that. But first and foremost, it'll go to those patrons who've been paying so long for this podcast, and it's so appreciated for that purpose alone. I want to reward them with the first shot at it. But like I said, I wanted to make it look good and seem better than it is. It's also a very short video, which is the other thing. It's only 5 or 6 minutes long, so I would like to surround it with a bunch of other things to put it in context. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. So if you're wondering why, when I talked about this at the beginning of the year and haven't done it yet, you'll now know why that's the case. So time and effort, big part of it. Having time when you're working a full-time job is sometimes difficult. So that's something I do, however, want to do because I think it's important to do. So with that all said, what brings you to doing a history podcast? I think the challenge of history podcasts, unlike, say, talking about a sports podcast as an example. So let's say you have a sports team you're really interested in, you want to talk about them. You can kind of talk about them how you want. You can talk about them. You can come up with stats, important figures and facts that you want to bring up. You could even, talk about old, famous players for the team, championships from years past. You can do those kind of things that have a historical aspect to them. So it's not just about doing the day-to-day stuff, but a lot of people just do day-to-day. What's the team doing? What's the transfer rumors if you want to use football? What's the trade rumors? If you want to use North American sports, what's going on with the contract of this person or that person? Are they going to want away? Is there going to be all this going on? So you can do a lot of discussion just on that kind of stuff. And because of that, I think people focus in more on that because it's slightly easier to do, I would say, than doing a thing where you have to do a lot of research on the history of something. And so it's a very different kind of environment. And it's not bad nor worse. And I would say it has its own set of challenges, which aren't the same with the challenges I face doing this podcast, but they are different. And the biggest one for me is just having to spend a lot of time and effort to find source material that gives me information and isn't spreading conspiracy theories or myth, which can be a bit of a problem, especially in the medieval era of Welsh history. Whenever I do this podcast, I always am considering of how I can go at an angle that makes sense or has a useful sort of storyline. And there are times when people have reached out to me, which I really do appreciate, and have said, yeah, I've never talked about this. Do you want to talk about that? I've never really talked about this. Do you want to talk about that? And honestly, sometimes there's things that I've never really even thought of, or maybe I've covered, but I've just kind of, given it a couple minutes coverage, and I kind of want to go back into it and cover it in more detail. And it makes a lot of sense to do it at that point in time. And sometimes maybe it doesn't fit what I'm trying to do, or it doesn't have a lot of application, or it's propaganda, or it's somebody's conspiracy theory about something, and I don't want to feature that kind of stuff. So there's that side of it too. And I know that sounds silly with a history podcast, but you'd be surprised. There are people who definitely have an agenda, and they've definitely want you to know about it. And that's okay. I mean, we all have points of things that we believe are accurate, which may or may not be accurate. And that's fine. As long as it's not harmful. I don't mind it. The King Arthur stuff is fine. Whatever. It makes no difference in the long run to the overall health and welfare of everybody. I mean, if you want to believe that King Arthur was a Welsh knight who led Britain against the Saxons and won great victories against them, there's nothing I can say that's going to change your mind. And if you don't believe any of that and you think it's a bunch of crap, there's nothing I can do to change your mind on that front either. At the end of the day, what we can do is talk about the history that we do have evidence of, and the history we have the writings of that are actually backed up by some archaeology is always handy. Like, I think about Owen Glyndwr, and you don't have to question whether Owen Glyndwr existed. You don't have to question whether Owen Glyndwr did stuff that had an effect on society in Wales. You don't have to question whether or not it's just a story to kind of, get people to fall in line or to believe in a myth so that it makes, them be more on your side. You're not some king in North Wales who's basically trying to find a way to justify why he took over the kingdom from his cousin. And so you're not justifying it with a bunch of history, as we would say. So for me, those kind of things I think are great, and I definitely want to spend more time on England or at some point with this podcast. Especially if I can get over to Wales, I will spend time at sites, at places, at locations. We'll do video, we'll do podcasts, we'll do the whole 9 yards, and that's my goal for next year. That's basically what it comes down to, because it is my belief that in the next year or two I will be back in Wales and living there full time. And if that's the case, then that will be one of my big efforts, will be to get this podcast to a point where we're doing actual on-site history and spending some time with historical things and trying to actually feature more people in Britain who actually have a relationship with Wales and actually understand and know. And I mean, one episode I would love to do is one strictly in Welsh, which I can't do. I mean, I am a learner at best at the minute, and I am, to use a Spanish phrase, I muy poquito. My language understanding, my sharai is not great. I was very much a neophyte at the best of times, and I'm trying to get better at it. In part because I hate the fact that I can't pronounce things properly, and I want to get better at that. So that is one thing that I've been trying really hard over the last year to try and get better at. I don't know if it's showing in the way that we're discussing things. I'm hoping it is, but who knows? I mean, people may listen to this and say, no, you still sound like a Canadian trying to say a Welsh word, and you're saying it very badly. So I understand that. Again, it's something I'm trying to work on and get better at. I see the podcast in that fact, and it's something that bothers me, let alone you. So I will continue to work on that. So that's my goal. And like I said, in the next year or two, my hope is to have this in a situation where I can start to really work on trying to get better at the podcast and make it even better. Not get better, but make it even better. Improve it, bring in more guests, more people to talk who understand it. And I think that'll be easier to do if I'm over there than trying to do it from here, where it's a lot more difficult because you're having to deal with the time difference, which is always a problem, and trying to deal with, not having a lot of contacts. And one thing I've realized over the years, not having a lot of contacts makes it very difficult. Plus, hey, if I'm over there, we can do things like meetups, and I can hopefully meet some of you people. And, as well as, the American and Canadian and Australian and everybody else who's listened to this podcast over the years. And maybe we can have some chats and a drink and, just kind of go over the history of Wales or your family history or whatever, And hopefully over the years, we've kind of identified that there is a lot to talk about and there's a lot to go through. And so much so that I'm not quite sure if by the end of this year we'll be out of the 1900s. We might not be. It would not surprise me if we're still talking about the end of the 1890s, not 1900s, 1800s, and talking about, the transition into the modern age, and just before we get to the real, build up to World War One. I think that's where we're going to be. I don't know how many episodes that'll be in the end, but I think that's where we'll be by the end of this year. I would not be surprised if basically all of 2026 is World War One and the lead up and the aftermath. That would not surprise me. There's so much source material to go through. There's so many things to talk about that it would shock me if it didn't become like that. But like a year ago, my wife bought me a book which is on the history of Wales during World War II, and it's an amazing book. But I said to her, I don't know if I'm going to get to that in the next 3 years. so, um, so she's always asking, so have you started reading it? I'm like, no, I haven't started reading it yet. I'm still doing this part, because it's like we just hit the 1800s when she bought me the book, and I said that's going to take a while to go through. It could take a year. It might take 2. I think it's going to be closer to 2 when it's all said and done, because we've spent a year on the first half, and now we're spending another year on the second half of the century. But that's kind of where my thought process is it takes a while to get through that stuff. And once you get into the 1900s, where there's so much more, where you start to get film and, you're getting more than just photos, which are new now. As you can see, I've been using them in the thumbnails of podcast episodes now. But as we get to kind of where there's video and there's lots of different coverage and there's lots of, you know, especially you're going to have much more secondary source materials, like, because professors and archaeologists and historians have been talking about this era a lot. The 1900s gets covered a lot in depth. There's lots of people writing diaries, and especially when they go to war, they're writing letters, and there's just so much more material to work with. It's going to be such a different sort of animal from what we've experienced over the years in Wales. And for me, it's both good and daunting, because that means there's going to be a lot to cover and a lot of different people and a lot of different things and a lot of different experiences, and trying to make sure that it all sort of matches the Welsh experience is important to me, because I don't want to. Because one thing I've tried to do this last few years is make sure that we don't dilly dally into a lot of larger experiences too frequently, because I found that when we started to talk about the English Civil War, especially, and the Hundred Years' War, it kind of, and then all of that kind of experience, it became very much a here's the outside of stuff, because there's a tangential relationship to Wales, which I want to avoid doing too much of. Not that it isn't important to talk about Franz Ferdinand and the assassination and all of the things that lead up to World War One and why they're important. But at the same time, it's important also to remember that the history of Wales is built largely on its own, with the extenuating things affecting it, and you don't want to wander too far away from it, because then you're starting to do a podcast that's on World War One and not a podcast that's on Wales's experience in World War One. So, yes, we're going to talk about the Somme. Yes, we're going to talk about Ypres and all of those kind of things, but we're not going to sit there and go, yeah, and this is day one of the Battle of the Somme, and this is how many people died, and this was the strategy and the tactics. We might, but I'm trying to avoid that if I can. I don't think you need a podcast about that. I think you need or at least my podcast shouldn't be about that. Let's put it that way. If I want to do a World War One podcast and talk about it, that's a totally different thing. There are loads and loads of places where you can watch and see and hear about World War One. So I don't want to belabor it from that perspective, but I do want to belabor it from the perspective of the experience of the Welsh men who went, and the women who supported them, and the children who had to struggle and suffer through the experiences there. And of course, it only gets bigger when we talk about World War II, because that affects the entire country from head to toe. And so much of the experience of Britain changes dramatically from being an imperial nation to becoming a non-imperial nation in a very short period of time, and how that starts to affect the view of the various nation states within Britain, and how the United Kingdom as a whole starts to see itself, and what's the effect of like Ireland leaving and the creation of Northern Ireland out of that. How do all those things affect Wales and kind of drive the nationalist movement in Wales, and what does that mean? All of these things can become massively amplified as we get into the new century. Don't want to spend time on it now because that seems silly, but it is something to keep in mind, is that that's part of it. So now let's focus back in on what I was wanting to talk about, which is how we got to here in the first place, which is that when beginning this podcast, I looked a lot around about formatting, about the thought process that goes into it, about the research that would be needed, about the books that would need to be bought. And I knew it was going to be a very difficult task. I tried to target specific categories of people who had a lot of experience and background in the subject that they're talking about. I'm very grateful to Charles Edwards's book on basically from 400 AD to 1000 AD, because literally that I relied on that massively during the medieval period. I also had a lot of time and effort being used up with Britain Begins, which is a book by Barry Cunliffe, who is a very well-known Welsh history and British history author who talks a lot about ancient history. And while some of the stuff has become dated over the years, there's still a lot in his writings that are important for us to look at and consider. And he does a great thing of going really knee deep into all sorts of things from, how does things get traded and the types of material that's being traded to, what the structures of society are, to how defensive things are being built and how all of this kind of features back on society as a whole in an era which we don't know a lot about. So it's an incredible book for that. And I've branched off with other books which help supplement it. But those are kind of the central books that I've used to try and keep things consistent and workable. And they've been really good on that front. And then, of course, finding primary source material like the Chronicle of the Princes, which gives you a rundown of the history of the Welsh princes, sort of, is how I would describe it, in a propagandist format. Let's put it that way. But it is actual legitimate history, and it's in the fact that it's been written down by monks in a period of time, going back and looking at past time. And there's no real difference from a lot of other monks that were doing similarly from Gildas to Bede in that period, and so they're important to consider, and a lot of what they do consider is important for us to know. Tacitus becomes a central figure for the Roman history in Britain, so especially the early history when the invasions and wars and settlement are happening. You get a much better understanding because of people like that. So again, they're always couched in yes, but on the other hand, though, without them, we'd have nothing, which wouldn't be great. So I think it's important to consider that when you're looking at these things. It's not that they're a complete solid history that we can take and just go with that. Yeah, they're definitely accurate. But what they do give us is more than nothing, which is what we would have had otherwise. So important to have, important to use, important to keep. So with all of that, I realize there's been a bit of a divergence, and it's been very focused on the development of the Welsh History Podcast and kind of where it is and how it came about. And I kind of didn't initially plan for that to be the case with this particular episode, but it's kind of where I wanted to go, so you kind of had an understanding of how it got formed outside of the usual discussion of, oh, by the way, I was wanting a podcast on Welsh history and couldn't find one, and thus got prodded into starting my own. That's kind of, and I always find it funny when people will complain about this Canadian that's doing the Welsh History Podcast, another foreigner, as I've had comments made. And I always look at it and I go, well, if there had been a Welsh person who was doing this at the time, I wouldn't have done it. It was the lack of someone doing it that drove me to do it. And, it is what it is. You get me. If you want to listen to 250 episodes of a podcast on Welsh history, that's what I've got to offer you. And I think it's a reasonably good podcast most of the time. And I think most of the subjects and the topics we've discussed have been important, and they're enlightening to me, even if hopefully they're enlightening to you too. And that for me has kind of been the key. Is it something that I see as being of value? If so, let's keep doing it. If not, let's move on and go to something better. And we try to do that. And one of the biggest things for me is I try and feature, the kind of things you wouldn't necessarily get if you were taking this at school. We kind of focus in on characters and figures who aren't necessarily always the ones that are like, oh, this is the famous person that discovered blah, blah, or they did this, or they led this army, or whatever. And if I can, I will feature them to an extent to try and give you a color of, oh yeah, it's not always about the super famous people that we all know and love. And it isn't always about the one rich person. So I think that's important. I think it's a key to understanding history as a whole, is that there are a lot of people who don't get coverage in history, who are the real reason why history even happens. And I think we do need to at least acknowledge that and give it a try to try and balance the discussion. Either way, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or hey, subject matter suggestions, you can always reach out to me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me at most social media at Welsh History Pod, with the exception of Facebook, which is facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And you can help the podcast through donation at patreon.com/Welsh History. Any donations, of course, are appreciated and not expected. But thank you for all who do. You are critical to this podcast. Believe it or not, you've helped me fund a lot of research I wouldn't have been able to fund on my own. And I really, really appreciate it. And I hope you understand that. And thank you very much. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.